Aston Martin is known for its loud, brash sports cars. It's what James Bond jumps into to get out of trouble, so it's understandable that there was quite a bit of head scratching in the Aston community when the company announced they were going to release the Cygnet, a small city car that wasn't even tuned for performance. Why did Aston release this car that was so clearly not an Aston? How could they justify selling it for 3 times the price of the car it was based on? And can you get one today for a bargain price? This is the Aston Martin Cygnet story. In the 2000s, car companies in the USA were selling small cars at a loss and were happy to do so. The reason was that the US government mandated that a car company's overall car portfolio had to hit certain fuel economy figures. Many US consumers wanted gas-guzzling SUVs, the larger the better, and they didn't mind the cost. So car companies sold SUVs with a big markup, and customers of small fuel-efficient cars got a bargain. The European Union decided on similar legislation in 2009. By 2012, car manufacturers had to comply with an average CO2 emissions goal across their range. That wasn't much of a problem for the likes of Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Lamborghini, Bugatti or Porsche. They were all owned by mass-market car companies who could offset their 6-litre V12 creations. Even Lotus had Malaysian car maker Proton as their parent. But Aston Martin were an independent operation. At the time, Aston Martin were actually quite indignant about being put in this position. Surely the EU should judge a car on the amount of CO2 it emits over its entire life. Astons were only driven an average of 6,000 miles a year, much less than most cars, which significantly reduced their CO2 impact. Of course, this wasn't taking into account the amount of CO2 it took to build the car in the first place, but in any case, Aston's words fell on deaf ears, so some creative thinking was needed. Maybe they could take a fuel-efficient car from another car maker and do some tweaks to make it their own, maybe from a friendly company that wasn't competing directly with Aston Martin. Toyota decided to produce a small city car and use their European design and development studio in Nice to style it. A Toyota IQ concept was shown at the 2007 Frankfurt Motor Show, and a year later it was on sale, sold in the US as the Scion IQ. The tiny car had 4 seats, but the rear had less room than the average Porsche. The front seat had to be pushed far forward for them to be even usable by children. But it could transport 4 around town in an uncomfortable pinch, fit into the tightest parking spot, and crucially for Aston Martin, it had very low CO2 emissions while delivering acceptable performance. The two companies entered into negotiations and soon a deal was struck. The Aston design team got to work on their strangest creation yet, an Aston Martin city car. The name chosen was the Cygnet, the name for a baby swan. It was fitting as Aston Martins were known for using doors that opened up like a swan's wings and appropriately dubbed swan doors. The Cygnet would be a baby Aston. When the news broke that Aston Martin was rebadging a Toyota IQ, some thought it was an April Fool's joke, but no, they checked the calendars and the news actually broke on June of 2009. Aston described the Cygnet as a concept, but word on the street was this was actually happening. Aston was making their most radical car yet. The next question was, would customers want it? After all, British Leyland had produced the Vanden Plas version of the Austin Allegro, and that hadn't gone down well. By the end of the year, Aston released some promotional shots of the Cygnet concept. It was described as a tender to a luxury yacht, a commuter car to get you from your Mayfair residence to your garage complex to drive one of the many regular Aston Martins in your collection. That sounded like a pretty small market, but Aston had hopes of selling 2,000 a year, initially only for Aston Martin customers, all in the name of CO2 emissions. On the outside it was clear this was a Toyota IQ with a new badge, But there was quite a lot that was new. The front bumper panel was swapped out to allow for an Aston Martin grille. There were extra vents on the bonnet, presumably to aid the souped-up engine. Those vents continued down the side, and there were tidy aerodynamic door handles and alloy wheels. At the rear there were new Aston-style lights, a spoiler and again a neat bonnet release. Overall, a nicer version of the Toyota IQ, but was this really an Aston Martin? Aston attempted to answer that question inside. There was the usual plethora of cowhides you'd see on a regular Aston Martin, alongside a place to dock your iPhone. But there was no denying the Toyota IQ origins, especially when you looked at the switchgear. A year later, Aston made a promotional video featuring a couple of parkour runners racing to be the first to drive a Cygnet. They didn't seem to be the target customer, especially as logic would dictate that running in a straight line would be faster than this exercise in manic jumping. Maybe these were just eccentric kids with millionaire parents. By the end of 2010, Aston announced that the Cygnet was real and production would begin at their Gaydon factory in 2011. Well, production would actually begin at Toyota's Takaoka factory in Japan, where Toyota built fully formed IQs, but it would end at Aston's UK factory. According to Aston, it was a car without compromise, just like every other Aston Martin. The Cygnet is small but luxurious, and Aston Martin tailor-fit for the city. No car company had done anything quite like this before, a truly luxurious city car that could fit into tight city parking spaces, and Aston saw there was a gap in the market. As they said at the time, luxury is not constrained by scale. But all this hubris was tempered with a dose of reality. Maybe after gauging opinion from the Aston Martin community, they backed off on the idea that only Aston customers could buy one at first. The order book was now thrown open to anyone. Aston weren't the only ones to think of enhancing the Toyota IQ. Over in Japan, Gazoo, Toyota's motorsports division, created a souped-up version of their own. They didn't do much to the 1.3 litre engine. After all, with the tight packaging up front, they couldn't exactly add much. But it got a 6-speed manual, stiffer sports suspension, better brakes, a sports exhaust so it could make all the right noises, a rear spoiler and a rev counter. But the bog standard engine meant it didn't matter how many Go Faster stripes you put on the IQ, it was still an IQ. That didn't bode well for Aston Martin, a company whose name was linked closely to fast sports cars. By 2011, the Cygnet got a price. Aston Martin's bespoke luxury commuter car would be available at prices starting from £31,000, 3 times that of a regular Toyota IQ. There were hopes of selling 2,000 cars a year initially in Europe, although Aston hoped to expand market availability the following year. And the Cygnet already had 200 pre-orders. Aston had just been voted the UK's coolest brand for the 5th time in 6 years, so why shouldn't the Cygnet sell well? Production work began in the same factory that Aston built the rest of its cars. Either a basic white or black 1.3 litre Toyota IQ was ordered with no bells or whistles. Aston's workers started by stripping the running gear, then the cars were rubbed down and hand painted. The white cars were used for light colours and the black could take darker colours. It took 50 hours to get the paint to the standard Aston demanded of all of its cars. Only then was the running gear refitted. Like on the concept car, the Cygnet would use custom body panels with Aston Martin cues such as the front grille and side air vents. The bonnet also got air vents, but they were just for show. The aerodynamic door handles didn't survive to the production model. Instead, they were the same handles seen on Toyota's regular IQ, colour-coded to the rest of the car. Inside was where most of the changes had been made. The interior was unrecognisable from the car that they'd started with. Like on the concept, it was filled with leather from the front and rear seats to the steering wheel, parking brake, dashboard, and even the grab handles, all hand-stitched. Toyota did offer a leather trim option on their IQ, but this was Aston leather and it was in another level of quality. Where there wasn't leather, there was Alcantara or brushed aluminium, like around the automatic gear stick. All told, it took 175 painstaking hours to complete a Cygnet. That was compared to maybe 10 hours it took to produce the regular Toyota IQ. No wonder it was 3 times the price given this attention to detail. The fact that this was essentially a 2+2 car, a 4-seater with only 2 practical seats, was less of an issue for a car company that specialised in 2+2 sports cars. Aston drivers only really used the front seats in any case. In some ways it was just as practical as the rest of their range, with fold-down rear seats that offered a fair amount of luggage space. What was lacking from the Signet was any technological bells and whistles. SatNav was a standard Garmin unit mounted next to the steering wheel that looked a little tacky next to the beautifully finished leather trim. It did have iPod integration, but that was courtesy of Toyota. Music was controlled via the steering wheel and a tiny display to the left of the speedometer. Aston would like to bring more features, but with such a low volume car, it just wasn't cost effective, so they had to mostly stick with what came from Toyota. There were 2 special white and black launch editions that pushed the price up to a staggering £40,000. For that extra £9,000 you got chrome accents on the door mirrors and the door handles, diamond turned alloy wheels and a special miniature 5-piece luggage set so it could fit into the Signet's tiny boot. The rear spoiler promised something special under the bonnet, but here customers were going to be disappointed. The engine was the same 97 horsepower 1.3 litre that Toyota had fitted back in Japan. The 0 to 60 time was 11.6 seconds. A little disappointing for an Aston Martin. You'd have to go back to the 1950s DB2 to find something slower, but there were good reasons for this. With it being a city car, it didn't exactly need to set a new fast time around the Nürburgring, plus as Gazoo had discovered, there was hardly any space under the bonnet to make it any faster. But the main reason was why the Signet had been created in the first place: CO2 emissions. Aston Martin wanted this car to be as fuel efficient as possible. It produced just 110 grams of CO2 per kilometre, and they didn't want it to produce any more. There was at least a choice of a 6-speed manual or a CVT automatic, which would presumably be the logical choice for a city car. But despite the Signet costing less than half the price of any other Aston Martin, the public remained unimpressed. There just wasn't a big enough market for a luxury city car, and the only close-ish competition, the Audi A1, cost half the price. And if you wanted performance from your city car, there was the Abarth version of the Fiat 500 with acceleration that threatened to best some of Aston Martin's regular cars, like the Aston Martin Rapide, which was surprisingly, given the name, the slowest car in Aston's range, barring the Signet of course. Undeterred, Aston released another special edition, the Signet and Colette, just a few months after launch. It was produced in collaboration with high-end Parisian boutique Colette, and this special edition pushed the list price up to an eye-watering £49,000. The Colette edition included a new chocolate-coloured interior with blue leather cushions that meant there was even less space for passengers in the back. This was to be the first of several collaborations for special edition Signets, but poor sales prevented any more of these from actually happening. Sales didn't pick up in 2012, and Aston finally decided to pull the plug at the end of 2013 after selling only 800 cars, 150 of them in the UK. Aston went back to producing large sports cars and swept the whole Signet adventure under the carpet. Well, almost. They were approached by one slightly bonkers Aston customer to produce a one-off Signet with a V8 engine hidden under the bonnet. Aston, of course, were glad to oblige for the right price, and so the 2018 Signet V8 appeared. The 4.7 litre V8 430 horsepower engine guaranteed this city car would be the first to get to the supermarket, probably leaving a trail of debris in its wake. The Signet V8 was less a Toyota IQ and more an Aston Martin Vantage S shortened, with a Toyota IQ body welded on to put it into stealth mode. This was why it got larger 19-inch wheels which protruded out the sides. Inside it was less the last word in luxury and more a track racer, with Aston controls lifted from the Vantage S. It was a masterpiece in packaging, and with a top speed of 170 miles an hour, it must have been a lot of fun and or terror to drive. But why could Aston Martin stop selling the Signet when the whole point was to offset the CO2 emissions from the rest of its gas-guzzling range? Well, in the end, the EU rules shifted. In 2013, they implemented rules that would come in by 2019 that mandated a reduction in CO2 emissions, but heavier cars could produce more CO2. It revolved around a complicated formula, but it meant that all car companies, including Aston Martin, needed to improve year on year if they wanted to avoid hefty fines. They could do that with plug-in hybrids, and they'd done a deal with Mercedes to get access to engines that offered this, but there was another way to avoid those penalties by doing a deal with another car company, say Tesla, to share their CO2 credits. And it's possible that Aston did just that. After all, they had a fairly low production rate, their cars weren't cheap, so they could afford to pay quite a lot per car for each credit. Since the Signet, Aston has begun to move with the times. They've introduced the DBX with a hybrid drivetrain, they'll launch their first plug-in hybrid, the Valhalla, in 2024, and have promised a fully electrified car by 2026. But they may not need to make any drastic changes. In 2023, the EU agreed low-volume car makers can continue using internal combustion engines beyond the 2035 rule that effectively bans them for mass car makers. 10 years after Signet production ended, is it possible to snap one up for a bargain price? After all, the price of a used Toyota IQ in the UK starts at £1,500. Well, prepare to be disappointed. Prices of the Signet start at £30,000 and go up from there. That's the price of a Signet when it was new. In fact, it's actually cheaper to buy a 2011 Aston Martin Rapide than buy a 2011 Signet. We really do live in a very strange world. The high price surely reflects the rarity of the small Signet, but maybe it also shows there is a market, however small, for a tiny city car with high-end luxury. An amazing 133 of the 150 sold in the UK were still on the road 10 years later. The Signet was a car born out of necessity, but it's become one of the most unique and sought-after car Aston has ever produced. The Smart Fortwo was a foot shorter than the Signet and has been on sale for a lot longer, but it's had just as many ups and downs. Watch the whole Swatchmobile story on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.